there's common traps that come with awakening itself. I would call these the danger of getting caught in certain cul-de-sacs or eddies or points of fixation. And they're very useful to understand because they can be quite insidious. They can kind of sneak up on one before you even know what's happening. And one of these dangers are the delusions that actually can arise as a result of an awakening experience is a certain sense of inflation or superiority. I would say, in my experience as a teacher, that this is probably the most common delusion that arises from awakening. Now, it's not a delusion that is inherent within awakening or within reality, but as I've said many times, once an awakening happens, they're actually traversing this territory from non-abiding awakening to abiding awakening, to really a permanent awakening. And part of this process of traversing non-abiding to abiding can be some of these dangers or delusions that happen where the ego grasps at awakening itself. It grasps at the realizations inherent within awakening, almost as if it grasps the raw energy of enlightenment itself and starts to utilize it for its own ends. The trickiness of some of these delusions inherent within awakening is that they can be very, very subtle. They can be hard to spot for the person themselves. For the people around you, they may be very obvious. So one of the really obvious places to get fixated or deluded is in a sense of superiority. It's very common in spiritual circles. Now, people can get stuck in a sense of superiority whether they're awake or not. It's a trap in the dream state, and it's also a trap from somebody sort of traversing from a non-abiding to abiding awakening. The ego of mind can come in and start to feel a personal sense of betterment, as if awakening makes oneself better or more superior to someone else. And this is very, very common. It's for many people, it's almost a natural part of the process. By natural, I don't mean to assume that it's truthful. It is a delusion. All sense of superiority is a delusion, but it's so common. That's why I call it natural, because it's very, very common. And inherent within this delusion is this sense of, I know. Because I have awakened, I know. Because I have awakened, I am right. Because I have awakened, I am always right. And because I can see through a certain aspect of the dream state, the ego, which is the constructor of the dream state, can actually take that perception and start to create what I call an enlightened ego. And there's actually nothing more distasteful than an enlightened ego. It's an ego that thinks that it's enlightened, an ego that thinks it's awake, an ego that's using some of the energy and realizations inherent within awakening itself to construct a new and superior sense of self. This superiority can be very, very tricky to spot. As a teacher, it's easy for me to point it out to people. It can be very, very hard for them to see it. Because, as I said, the ego will use the realizations inherent within awakening to hide. And this is part of the superiority. In extreme cases, I've seen people who have had maybe a very authentic moment of awakening, but as I've said many times, what's relevant is not some past moment of awakening, if it was real or not real, but it's not relevant what was in the past. What's relevant is right here and right now. And so there is a tendency with some people to have had awakening that's in the past and now is being translated through memory and through the mind into the present. And in extreme cases, the ego uses the realizations of awakening to dismiss anything and everything that it doesn't want to see. I've had people literally say to me, "But Adya, there is no ego, there is no me, nothing exists. if there's no ego and since there's no me, there's nothing to do, there's nowhere to go. And I'll say, yes, but have you noticed that you have an incredible capacity to act like a jerk sometimes? And they'll say, well, that may be true, but there's nobody here to do anything about it. There's nobody here. It's all the will of God. It's all spontaneously unfolding, they'll say. And to think that I should address it in any way is just more dream state delusion. Now, to get through to a person that's stuck in a place like that, that's a point of superiority. That's an ego that is grasping onto a certain insight and using it to barricade itself away from seeing its own illusions. It's using the insights of reality itself to hide behind. And this is a very subtle thing, that when the ego uses realizations to hide behind, to not actually come out into the light of being. When we're in a true state of wakefulness, we're never using what we've realized to hide from anything within ourselves. We never utilize it that way. So as soon as we notice ourselves using our own realization as a means to dismiss unconscious behavior, we should know that we're actually operating from a state of delusion. As I've said earlier, the absolute view of things, that there is no separate doer, that the ego is an illusion, that there is ultimately no separate entity to do everything, and everything happens spontaneously. This view of the absolute is true. But there's a deeper truth. The problem with this deeper truth is very hard to put into words. There's a scripture in the Zen tradition, the Heart Sutra, and part of the Heart Sutra says there is no old age, birth, and death, and no end to old age, birth, and death. And this is a very important part of this sutra. There is no old age, birth, or death. That is true. That's true from the absolute point of view. But unless we've also realized simultaneously there is no end to old age, birth, and death, it means if we haven't realized that, our realization is not complete. And if our realization is not complete, it is prone to be grabbed by the ego and used by the ego as a construct to hide behind and to justify lots of unenlightened behavior. It's very common in spirituality. It's very common to the ego to say to itself, oh, I've awakened, and I've seen that everything is spontaneous. Therefore, I'm not responsible for anything that happens. And if you don't like it, sorry for you. You just haven't seen the ultimate nature of reality. You know, this is a type of ego of delusion based on superiority. It's why I emphasize that in the part of the journey of going from non-abiding to abiding awakening, our greatest ally is a very deep and profound sense of sincerity. Because it's from this sincerity that we'll know, we'll get the sense, oh, this is arrogant. This is putting myself above others. This is actually a way that the mind is using inside itself, and sometimes the raw energy of awakening itself, to hide behind. And as I've said, as a spiritual teacher, this is a very difficult thing to get people to realize. Because this particular type of delusion, which is based in the ego using enlightenment or awakening to hide a sense of superiority, this is a very well-defended egoic structure. It's very difficult to get through. So what I've found sometimes is the most difficult egos to penetrate are those that have had some glimpse of reality. You wouldn't think it would be that way. You'd think, oh, if someone had a glimpse of reality, even if it was momentary, because it does have such a deep and profound impact, that the ego could never reconstruct itself in such a way that it's almost immune to any point of entry. But actually, in some people, this is the case, that they can become highly, highly deluded. I've seen this in my years of teaching, of people who come and have this very overt sense of superiority. And usually when they do, They want to make sure that people hear them and know what they know, that people agree with them, or more important, that people know that they themselves are enlightened. I've literally had people jump up onto the stage where I am and grab a microphone and start to tell the audience their version of what the truth is. This is, of course, a very extreme case. And in such a person, I often get the sense, well, I probably can't get through to them in the moment, but life, given enough time, life will get through to them. Because the beauty of life itself is that when we're functioning from something that's less than true, it won't ultimately work in life. Ultimately, it will break down. Ultimately, we will be brought to our knees in one way or another. Ultimately, we will be encountered with ourselves. There is no such thing as deluding ourselves permanently. It doesn't work that way. And so, each person should at least look and see if there's any sense of inflation, superiority, any sense of, oh, I've awakened from the dream state, and therefore any sense of, as if it were looking down your nose to anybody that you think is not awake. But know this, that that's not the view of true awakening. That's the view of an ego that's grabbing awakening and pretending to be awake itself. The true awakening never has a sense of superiority, never says it sees itself as higher than. But also it's important to know, some amount of this is relatively natural. Some amount of feeling superior is, in Zen we have a word for it called drunk on emptiness. It's being drunk, a bit drunk on the inherent energy and beauty of awakening itself. Now, if the egoic structure was really dissolved, there would be no ego to get drunk on it. But that doesn't happen in most cases. And so what's left of the egoic structure gets sort of exuberantly drunk on awakening itself, on the realizations of awakening itself. And I'm not saying that this is bad. I'm simply saying that this happens. And it's not really right or wrong. It just simply happens, sometimes in very overt ways, and sometimes in very subtle ways. So if you notice this happening, just notice that it's happening. It doesn't go away because you become horrified by it, any more than it goes away because you believe it and act it out. See it for what it is. It's an inherent part of the awakening process for a lot of people. Yes, it's a danger if you get fixated in it, if you identify with it, if your ego wraps awakening around it and pretends to be an enlightened ego, then it becomes very problematic. But if you stay in that place which is sincere, you'll know that any sense of superiority is not true, which will allow you to look and see, what are you saying to yourself? Literally, what is your mind saying to itself that's making you feel superior? Because remember, it's only the mind. It's only what we say to ourselves that deludes us. All delusions begin in the mind. All delusions are based on various ways that we're talking to ourselves and then believing what we're saying to ourselves. So the key of any delusion, of anything that separates us, is to see its genesis. What are you telling yourself that's literally creating the sense of it, whether it's superiority or anything else that creates the sense of division? Again, the key here is to be on the lookout for anything that makes you feel separate from anybody. And of course, feeling superior is a form of being separate. To feel higher than is a form of being separate. As when Jesus, in part of his ministry, when people were stoning a woman. And he said, "Let he who is without sin to cast the first stone." This is coming from a state of consciousness itself which is seeing non-separation. He is not seeing himself as better than the woman that's being stoned, for whatever reason she's being stoned. He's not seeing himself as separate, and he's trying to help those who would pick up rocks and literally stone somebody, accuse them, hold themselves in a place of superiority. And he's trying to show them that they are not really different from her. Let he who is without sin cast the first stone. And with that, one can see, wait a minute, nobody is without sin. Sin meaning to miss the mark. Nobody is without misunderstandings. We've all done things we wish we hadn't. We've all acted in less than enlightened ways. We're all really not different from anyone else. And so when we're operating from that point of view, it dissolves the sense of superiority. But just know, it may arise in the process. And the most important thing is just don't believe it. Just don't believe it. Don't push it out, don't try to push it away. But just don't believe it. If you stay in a state where you're not believing it, but also not pushing it out of your system, then there's a dissolving that happens. If you try to push it away, remember that whatever you resist persists. Whatever you try to push away, you're actually energizing it. So don't try to push it away. Don't try to push any negativity away. But also don't feed it. Just see it for what it is. That's the most important thing.